My name is Carolina Alfaro, and I'm the director for the Warrior Cross-Cultural Center. For those of you who are new to our space, our virtual Warrior Cross-Cultural Center, we are home to many different resources and programs related to diversity, inclusion, and social justice, which is our framework. We also are home to the Undocumented Student Services Office, and we're home to the Male Success Initiative to support our men of color in however they identify as a male, to support them through not only emotional support, but through support to help them in their careers, in graduation rates, and in very many different gender issues that they are faced with. We're excited to be here today to really just acknowledge some space and really take a moment to acknowledge that this Wednesday is International Transgender Day of Visibility, which is an annual celebration occurring on March 31st of every year, dedicated to celebrating transgender people and raising awareness of discrimination faced by transgender people worldwide. And so today's discussion, we feel, is very appropriate for that. We're also taking a moment to acknowledge that it is Women's History Month, and we're doing that by sharing her story. We're doing that by ensuring that we're highlighting and really taking a time to create space to listen to narratives and experiences by other women of color who share many different experiences that may be relatable to some of the students on our campus. And so we take a moment to acknowledge that. We also want to take a moment to acknowledge that our campus sits on Yokut territory, and we want to just show our gratitude and show our thanks. Take a moment to always be grateful for the protection of these lands that are unceded, these lands that still continue to be nurtured and cared for by people who are still in our region. There are families that are part of the Natotomy tribes here in our Central Valley, and it is them who we show gratitude for, and we continue to practice that so that we don't forget that our campus is here humbly honoring them and their lives. And so with that said, I want to say welcome officially once again, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Professor Dr. Tristan Cotton, who will continue with our program. So thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Can you hear me? Can you all see me? I think I've turned on the video. Can you see me okay?
I can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, I have on my video. I have it on. Not sure what's going on. Maybe it'll come on soon. Let me try to hit it again. Let's see if it'll. All right, let's try now and see if it comes. Okay, is that better? Is it can? Okay, fantastic. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I'm super psyched about today's discussion. And because I think it relates in many ways to some of the things I've taught in my classes, and I see some of my former students here present today, and so I want to say hello to you all, and thank you for coming, making time this afternoon. And so what I want to do in the beginning is sort of talk a little bit about the book and some of the things that I really enjoy about it, as just kind of by way of an introduction. And then I want to show you the book trailer. Catalina will show you the book trailer, and then we will go right into talking with Miss Green about how she envisioned Vicissitudes when she was working on it, and then a kind of a discussion between she and I around some of the issues that we think are important, particularly for this setting, and talking about issues about trans identity, particularly around bodily ability and disability. So it's quite apropos today is that it's this Transgender Day of disability. This kind of jives in well with what we're doing, some of the things we'll talk about today. But we'll also talk about other things around being Black and queer and trans and the complicated nature of that, which the book itself sort of highlights. So without further sort of going along those lines, let me say that when Miss Green first brought the book to me, I sat down and read it basically in about 3 days. It was kind of a page turner for me. I couldn't put it down, although I was supposed to put it down because I had other work to do. But as I started reading it and getting into it, I just, when I got to the end of the chapter, I couldn't stop. I just had to keep sort of turning to find out what would be the next thing, what's going to happen next in the book. And so it's sort of written along those lines to kind of push you forward in a way that's trying to find out what's going to happen with these characters. So it sort of builds the tension along as you read it. And so there are a couple of things about the book that I recognized immediately, both as a professor who teaches in gender studies, as well as a publisher who publishes trans and queer fiction. And what I what I felt, one of the first things that came off for me about the book is that it's one of the few books where we get some positive representations of trans characters, and particularly characters who are Black or people of color. There are several characters that are from Afro-Caribbean descent as well as African-American descent in the book. And as someone who teaches about intersectionality in my classes, I felt that the book delves deeply and intricately into the sensitive issues around being Black and queer and trans, and particularly issues of struggling around money, and our ability, or and we'll get more into discussion a little bit more about that. About when I say bodily ability, I mean around your bodily capacity, because that's also a layer in the book, which very much pleased me, because I feel like the work that we do both in Black fiction or Black studies and also sort of in Black literature, we don't explore those issues enough, particularly around being queer and trans and being disabled. So in terms of a broader audience, as a publisher, what I recognized about the book is that it has the ability to introduce people to what it's like to be Black and queer and trans, and to what people struggle with on a daily basis, which most of the general public, cisgender, is not aware of. But in particular, what I found illuminating about the book for a broader audience is the way in which it looks at the intersections of what it means to deal with racism and homophobia and gender normativity. The book has quite a few strong female characters. So also, in addition, what it means to be Black and female and lesbian. So it's a real treasure trove for exploring intersectionality on a number of different levels. And we hope to get into that discussion and kind of open that up for you and see and let you see what that looks like. And maybe even if we have some time, we can have a discussion with other folks too. Like I said, I saw some of my students here, so I know you guys have had some of my classes in the class, and you've listened to me talk about this sort of stuff. So without going any further, what we want to do is Carolina is going to show the book trailer that we created for the book, and then we're going to allow Miss Green to open up and give a few words about why she wrote the book. Thank you, Carolina. Okay. Miss Green, I'm going to introduce here Kim Green. She's written several books. It's not her first rodeo. She's quite proud of this one. So, Miss Green, why don't you tell us a little bit about the book and why you wrote it?
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for having me. And I'll just ask the first question before you do, which is, why would any cisgendered woman dedicate 5 years of her life to write a book about an African-American woman, much like myself, falling in love with a trans man? And it's a good question, and one that I've been asked many times. And the answer is that as an African-American author, I venture to write about worlds that expand our reality. It is my greatest fear as a writer that if I rely on the narrow tropes that define us, it shrinks what's possible for our lives. For me, writing Vicissitudes was an opportunity to write about a love that questions. The questions that Vicissitudes asks are, where does love come from? Is it from our hearts or our heads? Do we make the decisions based on what we were told to feel? Are these prescribed notions of love and gender and sexuality broad enough? Are they inclusive enough? My characters, Morgan and John, take us on a journey to find out who we could be if we just let love do its job, which is to transform us. Vicissitudes is a modern day love story written from a place of what if. My intent is that it challenges readers to ask themselves, what if they were to feel love for someone unexpected or someone whose society has already erased? I wanted to explore and advocate for the transgender lived experience and take it out of hiding, not necessarily the physicality of it, which is slowly emerging in the media, but these appearances are still too often reduced to mere extras, without context and without the world's interest or curiosity to see the trans community as a whole and human. I wanted to write a character that has the rare opportunity to find a safe place to share his truth, be himself, and educate others. When I think about Black trans love and resilience, I feel that my characters are all seeking love, and in finding it, they emerge resilient. Vicissitudes is a book that stands on the foundation of resilience, which in another word is survival. The characters that I've written are each managing adversities that define their lives. What they realize is that by opening their hearts, it's easier to love themselves, others, and ultimately to be loved. It is my hope that in reading Vicissitudes, you will discover that by expanding your own vision of the world and yourself, transformation is your only choice. That is my prayer for what Vicissitudes will offer to you and your life. And I look forward to talking to you all about all the things that go on in Vicissitudes. So Tristan loves to talk about this. So please, let's talk about it.
Okay, thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. It's the professor in me that loves this book and the literary critic. And sort of what I mean by that in part is that in your book you push against some of the familiar tropes and stereotypes that we get of Black folks and queer and trans people, and you give us an alternative model, yet those are also very realistic models. They're not this sort of fantasy world of people with lots of money and people with lots of choices. Indeed, your characters are struggling with a number of different issues, not just what might seem to be so obvious, right? So I recognize it as valuable even for the classroom for that matter, but also, as you point out, it's almost has an instructional or I guess informative dimension to it, where it really asks us to pose that question: what if you fell in love with someone who society has written off? And we know that as people of color, as queer people, as trans people, as female-bodied people, whether that was at birth or whether we claim that identity now after a transition, we know that we are marginalized, and we are people who have been sort of written off by society. And so I think it's what I love about the book too is the way you enfold these different types of journeys together in a multi-layered narrative. And so that's one dimension of it that I really appreciate. And then there's this other aspect that I like about it too, where all of these folks who are marginalized because either they're people of color or they're queer, or they're trans, or they're female, you have this way in your writing of making those people actually normal and normative without calling attention to or needing to apologize or explain somehow why they are the way they are. And so one of the things I love to point out, the tactic it seems that you use is in the book, for example, is that the book opens with a lesbian wedding. It opens with an interracial wedding, two women getting married across cultural and racial ethnic differences, but it just simply begins there. It doesn't begin with a coming out story or some sort of explanation that these people are making a choice outside of the traditional heterosexual norms. It just sort of boom, you open it up and here two women getting married. And that then becomes the occasion that the novel that the narrative sort of kicks off. So one of the things I want to sort of start off our conversation with today is when you talk about writing the book as a way of humanizing trans people, and particularly in this case, we're talking about humanizing Black people as well, humanizing Black and trans people. And so I'd like for you to just sort of go into that a little bit about what you're doing in the maybe some characters, to talk a little bit about what you were doing with certain characters to make that possible, or in sort of how trans people are seen, how Black people are seen, and what you were trying to push against in your book in terms of creating and giving us a much more complicated perspective of folks.
Well, I think the writing of John was a really amazing experience for me. And it actually came from this, like I said, writing from the position of what if? What if I fell in love with someone that was different? And when I think of African-American literature and African-American male figures, all human beings struggle. So we all have our struggles. But the African-American male struggle seems to be always similar. It's always economic, it's always a lot of violence and abuse. These kinds of things come up a lot, and I understand them, and I think they're powerful examples, but I also think there's so much more to all people. And I like to write about those things that we don't really learn about and read about much. And I wanted to create a male character that was really unique and was not necessarily struggling with those things alone. I wanted even to create yet a new struggle, and sort of an LGBT struggle that is unusual and not spoken about much. So that's kind of what happened. And then I did my research and started just in the beginning of starting the research. And I would look at YouTube, because YouTube happens to be a very powerful thing for the trans community, because it allows people to show their change over time. And it really helps a lot of beginning transitioners to see what's going to happen to them. So it's like a really powerful tool. So here I was, the cisgendered woman, spending weekends at a time watching these videos and just learning about these men as they were becoming who they say they are. And so I started sort of falling in love with them, having a bit of a crush on them. They were just powerful and courageous and really committed to themselves. And so that was sort of became what the book was going to be. It was going to be falling in love with a person who's transitioning. And so I think that was sort of the impetus for choosing to write about John and him being transitioning in the, because I could have written him already transitioned. And then that story would have been very different, but I wanted to go into the struggles and the humanity of what it is to make this decision, what it is to have people deal with it, or not deal with it. And so I just really wanted to get involved in all of that. And so that was sort of the idea of writing about that, and also to heighten this conversation of what transgender means and what the struggle is and why it's important.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of those struggles, because I think one of the things I love about this book is that it's a very sensitive exploration into some of the things that trans people deal with just on an everyday basis, and just like the decisions that you make in life. And when I teach research articles or books, those books help people, my students, to understand in a conceptual way or in a theoretical way. But one of the things I find helpful about literature and about personal testimonies is it really gets into the nitty gritty of like what the systemic structures, how they come to bear on us in the everyday, and the choices that we simply make. Like, for example, bathroom choices, things like that. So let's can you talk a little bit about some of the things around trans identity that you thought were important to highlight in the book, whether it's John's character, there's the kid, there's Teague, one of his students. Yeah.
Well, I think what's important about the trans experience, of course, is changing who you were to be who you say you are. And just sort of metaphorically, that's really interesting to me. And that's true for all people. I feel like we all are transitioning, whether it's people who, grew up a tomboy and then grow up and get married to a man. Like, that is an interesting thing. It's a transition. So we all are experiencing our transitions every single day. And I think until we're able to understand that and have empathy for transgender people, because they're just going through what we're going through, but in a larger scale. So that's one thing. And the other thing, I guess the key idea is, like you mentioned, is the decisions that you make. Do you go to the bathroom of the gender that you say you are, or you go to the gender of the bathroom that you were born in? And what a political disaster that has become. You also struggle with, do I tell people that I'm trans? Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not so obvious. And so there's always this conversation of disclosure. How do you share that with other people, and what are their reactions? And there's always the promise of some violent reactions. And then there's a promise or a hope for some empathetic reactions. So John has experienced both. In the book, he's had relationships with people and had violent responses. And then he finally meets this one person that embraces him. And I think that is like one of the treasures of this story, is that there is hope, and that you keep going, and that we all go through adversity, but whatever it is, we have to keep trying until we find the person. But there's always a person who's going to love you. And so I think that was one of the things. But the choices of the bathroom, choices of having the surgery or not having the surgery, that's a huge choice. The expense of that, and based on the fact that a transgender person usually has harder time finding employment. So if you can't find employment, you can't find medical benefits that will pay for this thing. How do you live? How do you live a life where you have to save every dime? Trying, this piggy bank lifestyle for an adult is very hard. So John literally goes through that, like a character who's saving every dime to be able to save up to have a surgery or not have a surgery. He has to decide, but he feels that's what he wants to do. So again, adversity, we all have this. It's for women, it's if I'm single and I have children, how do I pay for their daycare? Or do I not work and stay home? Adversity creates so much. And that is where resilience lives, is where you make these decisions and you prevail. So I think with John as a character, I did not want him to be a tragic trans character who can't get anything. My John, he works, he has a great job. He does have money, but he has to use it because he's saving. Again, another choice. But then he meets somebody he loves, and then the money becomes a different thing, and he's willing to spend it. So, I think the book talks about the vicissitudes, people and places that change, and the way that the world is changing. But it also talks about the idea that everything is a change. So he was so sure that he would never spend money, he would never be in a relationship, he's got to get through this surgery. And then he meets somebody and he's like, I'm going to spend money. I love this person, I want to do it. So we all transform as we grow. And I think that's something that is very much addressed in the book.
Yes, and I think also one of the things that's fascinating about him as he's saving up for surgery, when he meets her, then the question becomes whether or not he may need surgery or not. Like at some point, that issue comes up, whether or not that's even relevant for them in their love and their relationship. I think also what I liked about John's character is that you write him in a way that contradicts or pushes against toxic masculinity, which is what we typically see of Black men, representations of Black and brown men. It's not just Black men, it's Latino men as well. And it's just something we just sort of fall back onto, this sort of thug character. And you wrote John very much against that character. I mean, he's a guy who loves children, right? He's a teacher, which also pushes against the notion of trans people as pedophiles and weirdos. And you allow him to have a loving relationship with Rain, Morgan's daughter, the woman he's in love with her daughter. And so I think it's these little things that I think that create the whole character of John that is also transforming the way that we think about Black men and about trans men. And that's wherever you are, even trans men within the community can benefit from exploring John's character as a what if character for themselves. Maybe you don't need surgery to be happy or be in a successful relationship. Maybe it is possible for you to get a good job and not just deliver pizzas. Not that's a bad thing, but oftentimes the socioeconomic reality and the discrimination means that trans people end up sort of taking really, low paying, non-insured jobs. And so I appreciate you for creating that, for those nuances within his character. And so actually want to get to this while we're talking about the bathroom and choices and identity and masculinity, and we're pushing against notions of Black masculinity, against toxic ideas of Black masculinity. There's the part in the novel toward the end where John ends up in a big brawl and with another character in the book. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Jax's character, like, why is he sort of, you juxtapose him with John, and then they end up in this brawl, and why that's particularly important in that moment around trans stuff.
Well, I think what's so fun about John is that he, like you said, pushes against all of the stereotypes. So John is a big reader. He loves books. So he lives in this very tiny place. And the most important thing about the place is the books. So he's really curious and intellectual and all of these things. And he's gentle. I mean, he has a gentle spirit. And so that's true already. And then he makes this choice. Again, in the book, it talks a lot about him not using the bathroom in public, never using the bathroom, committed to that. And then, as he's getting in this relationship with Morgan, he starts to loosen up. Like all of the pieces of him just start loosening up a little. So he goes to visit her at her job. She's in the recording industry. And he says, let me get a couple bottles of water. Because in the record industry back in the day, I will say, everything was free and lots of it. I don't think that's true anymore. But anyway, there's free water and free drinks and beer and all that stuff. So he says, let me get a couple bottles of water. And so Morgan, knowing his rigidity around the bathroom, she's like, he shouldn't be drinking all this water. Like he's going to have to go to the bathroom. And he just feels very comfortable. And so he says, I'm going to have this couple bottles of water. And then he says, let me go to the bathroom. So she's very panicked. And then she works in a recording studio, and there are rappers in the house today. They're recording something. And so they meet up. And the Jax is a Jamaican character who is very, an example of toxic masculinity. I really wanted to have him in there because he's real and out there too. And obviously has this gaydar that Caribbean people tend to have. They sort of can spot a gay person a million miles away. And he spots John and sort of immediately knows that he's trans somehow and attacks him. And so there's a big fight. But what's important about the fight is that John prevails. So he wins the fight. So here's Jax with his entourage, all these rappers that are all, in the music business and all like there to protect him. And he ends up winning the fight because he's physical. He's a coach. He's an athlete. So he's strong physically. But I think what's important about this brawl is that John prevails. And at that moment in the relationship with Morgan, he realizes that he is a man. He is a man, and he found himself in that brawl when he's faced with this toxic masculinity that is a certain way, has a way of being that is not the way he is, but he also knows who he is inside. And that's where he prevails. And I think that is sort of a really metaphorical moment for him finding his manhood, still pre-surgery, but finding it in being standing up for himself in attack mode when he's being attacked for this being trans. So I think that those are the moments that we see people transforming throughout the whole story. And that's kind of what I would want people to find those places and then find them in themselves.
And I'll chime in too and just sort of follow up and say, for me as a trans man, one of the things about that brawl is just how realistic. I was so struck by the realism particularly for trans men. And maybe this also happens for trans women as well in the bathroom. But what I can say for trans men is that most of us probably have not been raised to fight. I was raised up in the hood. I did have to kind of fight my way out of that. That's real. That's what it is. But then you move on and then you just become someone else. You go to college and whatever and become middle class, that whole thing, and you forget how to sort of do that sort of thing, or you're just not raised to be that way. When you transition into male social embodiment, there are times when you find yourself in context where you were pushed and you can't get out of it. It's going to be a physical thing. It's going to be some slinging of mud verbally. And so that I found particularly realistic, even for the most nonviolent guys like me, have ended up in a situation where I really felt pushed into defending myself physically, because they actually didn't know that I was trans, and they just, so in other words, it's sort of, I like how you captured the reality for some trans men when we enter into the world of male sociality. There are new things that you have to learn. Even if you want to avoid physical violence, sometimes, this is the reality of that context. And I think also I wanted to say that there's this part where you have what I think is revolutionary about John winning that fight is because in that context, he is positioned as not a man.
Right.
Because you remember when Jax says to Morgan, you need a man who can do work. Why don't you explain that to the audience, that concept, that Caribbean concept, just in like why that's important?
Well, I have to credit my partner, who is Jamaican. And we were talking about this whole situation, and I asked her, what is a really disgusting thing that he could whisper into Morgan's ears when he's faced with looking at John and being like, that's the man who's being with Morgan. And so she said, oh, they often say you need a man who does work. And work is W-U-K, very important. So, and really, that's really about sexuality. It's like somebody who can have sex with you. And that's the work that you need to do. And so I think for John, he was very put off by that whole whispering thing. He didn't even really hear what was said, but him getting so close to her and whispering something, it was obviously about him. And I think that was why the fight is so important, because at that moment, you don't necessarily need a penis to be able to know who you are, to stand up for yourself, to fight for your girl. I mean, that was a moment for him. He was all of those things. Despite the lack of the physicality, he was still all of those things. He was strong. He was stronger than Jax, because Jax has an entourage, by the way, because Jax can't fight. He's the rapper and has all that going on for him, but he's got the record deal, I guess, but he doesn't have, the physicality to fight anybody. So this is why he brings all these people with him. So it's important for John to have experienced that, because at that moment in the front of Morgan, he actually did the work that needs to be done to be with a woman. Right. That was really powerful for that moment. So I think it's all these moments where people are transforming and changing based on adverse reactions of what's going on in their lives, but also to learn themselves and know their own strength. And that was a big part for me, for John, in the brawl.
Right. Yeah, the penis does not make the man. Yes. In other words, and the toxic masculine. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
There's a lot about that in the book, like the penis.
Right, and the toxic masculinity of some cisgender men is in the book is shown to be simply that, a front and a sham. And if you poke it just a little bit, it just blows.
Yeah.
Right. It is a toxic masculinity is more of a performance than any real reference to, an underlying body part or its ability to, good. Okay, great. So with that, let's sort of do a little shifting to talk about some of the women in the book, because you have some very strong women characters in the book, and they all do different things in the book. So let's talk a little bit about some of those characters. Let's start with Morgan, for example.
Well, I love writing about Morgan because she is, and I don't ever want to use the word typical because we're all so unique, but our journeys are often pretty like pattern based. So she's a African-American woman who was in a relationship, was married to a man who cheated, blah, blah, all of that. So she's lonely. She's a single mom. She has to work to take care of her child. She has lupus, which is another big thing that's similar to, in it, you see the parallel with she and John when they realize that they have this physicality issue that is hidden. People can't see it right away. So having lupus is a very invisible kind of illness. So she's got lupus, she's a single mom, she's been hurt emotionally. So she has her armor up, protective, not wanting to fall in love and all of these things. So I think that's a big thing about Morgan, because she's the center of the book, and in terms of her transformation and changing and able to loosen up and wanting to love again and finding love, even though it's unexpected love that she certainly never planned for. Which is another big thing for me in writing the book. I want people to kind of imagine themselves doing things that they never thought they would. but because of their hearts and what's real for them. So that's one character. And then there's Renee, who's an attorney, and she's also gay, and she also has lupus. And she is a very strong character, but she's also a different version of an LGBT character. I think she's, and that is a type of woman that we see all the time, but it's just a different personality, which is a lot of had a homophobic background, parents disowned her, all of this. And so the way to stand up to that, she became an overachiever. So she's very well read. She's very smart. She knows a lot. She has sort of a bit of a know-it-all personality, which gets turned around at the end. She doesn't know everything, we find out. And so I think that is, she exploring her and her weaknesses, even though she's so strong, was a very important thing too, to just turn that around. And then we have Rain, who's a 9-year-old girl, who is the daughter of Morgan. And she's a very sassy person. And I love her because she really is a teacher for Morgan. She's a teacher for Morgan. She teaches her to love, teaches her to open up, teaches her to give where she would not ordinarily give. And that is, it's fun to see a child teach, and that we know that, and you as a teacher know this, young people have what we need. They're telling us the future in just the way they're being and the way that they see the world. And so I think Rain is a great character. And then we have a little girl in the book who's also 9, and she's disabled. And she ends up meeting Rain at the beach, and her mother is taking care of her even though she's in a wheelchair, and she loves the water. And so her mother mothers her in a way that's different than the other mothering that occurs in the book, and takes the daughter into the water because she loves the water, even though she's in the wheelchair, like despite the wheelchair, despite the disability, acknowledging what she loves, which is water. So there's all these different things going on with the women in the book, but their strength is very much a part of them dealing with adversity, whether it's physical, whether it's lupus or disabled in a wheelchair, whatever it is. It's these women who are fighting for themselves, which I think is which is John is doing, fighting for himself, fighting for who he is. So it's complicated, of course, but the women are an important part of the book, even though the book is about a man transitioning. So I think it's sort of an interesting parallel.
And okay, so great. So let's drill down a little deep with and talk about Renee's character, because I think you sort of talked a little bit earlier when you spoke, introduced at the beginning. You talked some about Morgan, and one of the things that that character allows you to do is to sort of pose the question to cisgender women, heterosexual identified women, is, what happens if you fall in love with a transgender man? What would that journey look like? And so I want to explore for a second Renee's character, because I think that gets to another level of intersectional issues around Black identity and queer identity. And without giving it away to the audience, there is this moment in the book that where Renee does something with her mother's ashes. Her mother has died, and there's a funeral. And then there's something that happens in the book. And I remember when I read it, I was beside myself, because I thought, this is blasphemous in the Black community. It's for reasons that are very culturally specific. And but it was very daring for you to do that as an author. I very much think that I really appreciate authors who take a chance and go out who build a limb that might be flimsy, and then walk out there on that limb and just to see what happens. And you very much did that. And I think that's an important piece in the book to helping us delve into intersections of being Black and queer and female too, So let's open that up a little bit for folks. Tell us what's going on there with Renee.
Well, I think Renee had the horrible experience of having her mother turn on her whole family turn on her because she's gay. And what's interesting about Renee is that she's, again, like I said, smart, very well established, an intelligent attorney. And so what she has chosen to do, which is very much who she has very, 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 very short hair. And that's something that she prides herself on. She loves her hair. And her mother has always said to her growing up, grow your hair, grow your hair, grow your hair, which leads into the conversation of African-American female identity in the workplace, for example. And so as a girl growing up as a gay young girl and knowing that this is the thing that her mother is always telling her not to do not have short hair, grow your hair, which is what we all are living with in the society right now. The Crown Act, how did that come about? Because corporate America was discriminating against women of color for their hair. You can't have dreadlocks, you can't have braids, you can't have tweets, you can't have all these things. So, these are the adversities that Black women face in many ways that are just it seems shallow, but it's very much a part of who they are and why they're so strong and so defensive and angry inside, because they live with all of this loneliness, this discrimination, this lots of voices about their appearance, how they should look, why their hair is not long enough, their skin is not light enough, well, all these things. So African-American women really are, obviously so strong and so important to everything, but they struggle. And so their personalities are always sort of interesting, a little intriguing. So, Renee does this heinous act that happens, but it's because of hurt. I have these sort of outrageous characters that do outrageous things, but it's because I'm always digging into the hurt, the motivation, what would make her do what she did to her mother's ashes. But it's, so much hurt and so much abandonment from being who she is. And the book really asks us all to look at the places where we're abandoning ourselves when we subscribe to things that are not who we really are. So that is always controversial because we really live in a world that's sort of set us up to be a certain way. And what the vicissitudes that the world is facing right now is everybody's fighting back and saying, you know what, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do what I was told to do, to marry a man or marry a woman or whatever it is. I'm going to be who I really am. And I think that is causing, the earth to sway a little bit.
Very good. Let me add to that. I was thinking too, what was the moment when you said about how Black women are sort of told to do this and told to be that way, and the line is so thin that you're gonna fall off the tightrope, somebody's tightrope somewhere. It's just almost impossible thin line to walk. But there's this way too that your book, in some ways, the way you delve into Black women characters reminds me of some of Alice Walker's early writing. Mm-hmm. And I wrote my dissertation on the first 16 years of her books and publications. And she takes on she has characters, Black female characters, that are quirky sometimes, that are very much defiant, that are very hard to pin down and pigeonhole. And one of the things that I learned from her work, as well as Toni Morrison, that I can kind of see what you're playing with in Vicissitudes around Renee, mm-hmm. and Morgan for that matter too, is that women in general, I think, are held to a standard of visuality, visual presentation, and gender normativity, what you should be a wife, be a mother, be these things that I think all women in one way or another are subjected to that. And then what you learn is that depending on a woman's what her ethnicity or race is, she then is burdened, and I'll just put burden in quotes. I don't mean it in a value judgment. I just mean it as something that's weighing on you. She then takes on the burden of the racial narratives, or the narratives around your own race and culture, that are imposed on you as a female. And this was something I found really interesting in Alice Walker, as well as in the characters in Vicissitudes, the female characters, is that it's not just, Black women aren't just called to sort of be women in the way that we traditionally patriarchal think of women, but there's this other level of it, is if you choose not to have children, if you choose to be gay, somehow you're turning against the race and the racial struggle. And there's a beautiful line in some of Alice Walker's, I think it might even be in Meridian, where her mother is just giving her hell about cutting her hair short, wearing overalls. The character's name is Meridian. The name of the book is called Meridian. And there's a moment in there where her mother says, and she lays the guilt and shame on her, of slave women. And she says, how can you go and have this abortion when the women of our race were not allowed to keep their children? And oh my God, you can just feel the weight. But what's going on there? And I think what I see too in Vicissitudes with Renee's character is there's this an additional sort of, or again, at the intersections of being, the gender normative narrative and then the racialized gender normative narrative come very much head to head in Renee's character. And she shaved, one of the reasons of shaving her head, being bald, is to push back against sort of all of that. And she's also still, to me, I think she's a very feminine character. I might be wrong, but that's how you write her. She seems still feminine in some ways,
Yeah. And she also is married to a white woman. So, I mean,
right. That's another race trading type of another race trader move, it's, I love the book is just layered and packed with all of that's the literary critic in me. That's part of me that loves it, thinking along those lines. So okay, very good. Let's talk a little bit about another character, another woman character in the book, Bethany.
Mm-hmm.
And what you so actually she's Renee's wife.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So tell us a little bit about Bethany and what Bethany allows you, what you're doing with that character.
Well, Bethany is another character who has a disability. She has mental illness. And so and she's gorgeous, by the way. She's a very beautiful woman. She's in the fashion industry. She's all of this. And it's something that is hidden, much like lupus, much like being mid-transition, all of these things that we don't see about people because we're so busy looking at their outside, we don't see their inside. And so she has a very strong long-term relationship with John. She knew him, she knew John before this transition. And she just has a lot of feelings about that. And she's struggling with his transition. And I can talk about Bethany for a long time, but I won't, because I think it's very important people read her and read the things she says and does. I mean, she's a very complex character, but I think what's important about her is that she is a symbol, the very important symbol of something that's missing in the trans narrative. Because so there's, we talk about transition, and there are people who love it, and then there are people who hate it. It's bad, you shouldn't do it, it's terrible. And then the people who love it, be yourself. And then there's this other piece of the whole trans conversation of the people who lose the people they knew to transition. So there's this bunch of people who are mourning, all these mothers and fathers and people who are married to a husband or a wife, and then that person is changing and they're transitioning. And so that is a whole piece that is never talked about in this transition conversation. So I really wanted somebody who is going to nail it, the pain that is suffered, because those are people in mourning as well. So there's a lot of life giving, there's a lot of life affirmation in transition. And then there's also a mourning piece of the people around the transition. And so Bethany is just sort of a symbol of that, like the mourning, the loss of somebody who you once loved, and then they make this change, which you want to celebrate them because you want them to be happy, but there is still a loss of all of that experience that you had with that person because that person is no longer there. And in the book, it talks a lot about the dead name and the past, which is not addressed. And the trans community has chosen to never talk about the past. They don't want to. It's important to them because they can't go forward if they keep looking back. And so that is still painful, though. It's painful for the people who were a part of that past. And so Bethany is sort of a character who's a symbol of that. So she's really central to this conversation, and it's something that's not talked about much. It's either, you pro-trans or not, but then there's that other piece that we never talk about. And those people are the hidden people who lose a lot in the transition.
Right. And I what I love about, and I think I sort of said at the top of the hour about, as a teacher, I teach about trans and queer identities, and you sort of teach theoretical material, research material that very much gives students a sort of a concept or conceptual understanding. But having a concept of something isn't the same thing as being able to relate, say, emotionally, being able to relate narratively or personally. And there's something really valuable about personal narratives and literature that gets into the intricacies and the nitty-gritty of the process that human beings are going through. And so we can talk about partners of trans people. So people have done a little bit of research on it in academia, but not a lot. Again, in the trans community, there's this kind of bipolarity. It's like either you celebrate transition, you're on board and you're like, yay, we're doing it together, or and if you so there's that's sort of the expectation that parents jump on board, partners jump on board, your kids, everybody, we're all going down the journey together. And so, and I think it's important to celebrate people's journey, but I think it's also, like you're saying, it's important to recognize that in this journey, there are multiple voices and there are multiple experiences and multiple relationships, all of which they're emotionally laden. And so when I talk in trans context, sometimes when people want to bring that up, when a parent wants to bring up these issues or that they have some feelings about this, it's hard to do that because people sort of give you one or two choices. You're either jumping on board from day one, and if you're not doing that, well, then you're not being supportive. Somehow that you're
transphobic, and that you're a hater, and that's not always.
Yeah. So, and I think what I like about the book and about Bethany's characters, because it's a big piece of a thread. It's a big thread that runs throughout. But in a book, you get to open her feeling, you get to open up her mind, and you get to show readers this is what goes on for a partner when they're losing someone. And in her case, she had already left. They had already disbanded that relationship before. No, John transitioned. That's right. And that's what disbanded it. Right. Yeah. But there's what I love, and she ends up, well, I won't say that part, but I won't say where she ends up, but I don't want to give it away. But what I love about it is the way that you unpack the emotional journey for people who are partners and are experiencing a loss. Even when they want to be supportive, you can't always just jump right into the swimming pool with everyone else, because you still have these emotions and these feelings that are very much real and that they have to be worked through. And so that's what one of the things I love about her character, and just about the use of literature and personal narratives to sort of talk about that, because people can't really get in and sort of see and imagine especially if you're not someone who's been a child of a parent transitioning, or you've had a partner who decide to transition. It's hard to kind of fit yourself into that narrative. No. Yeah. So I appreciate that. I wanted to explore just a little bit, and then we can kind of open it up for questions and answers, for questions from folks. Is many of the characters have disabilities, and you have various kinds of you explore various kinds of disabilities throughout the book, and some of which overlap and are parallel. And so I want you to talk a little bit about why that was particularly important for you to bring in this context.
Well, I think because people are very used to everybody being beautiful. And obviously beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but there's so much emphasis on our visual appeal. And I wanted John, because John is in transition, he's a man in transition. Physically, there's problems for him, and he feels, and Morgan, same thing. She's got lupus. She feels because of her illness, there's physical things on her. Her skin has trouble. She's got all these things that she's not desirable. And so I think what both John and Morgan go through is talking about their bodies and how their bodies are not ready for love, not going to be accepted because of these issues with their bodies. And so I really wanted to be real clear about that. And I wanted to paint Morgan as highly imperfect. In the very beginning of the book, she's having foot problems and she's limping around in the wedding, and because of her feet hurt and her shoes are too tight and all these things. But it's because she's got lupus and she's got issues with her joints and her knees and all these things. And so at one point in the book, my favorite part of at least this piece is that he describes her. So he's watching her from afar and he's thinking, oh, her eyes are puffy and her ankles are swollen and all of these things that are all the things that would make a typical man just be like, oh, couldn't go out with her. She's got issues, she's not perfect. And again, obviously she gets involved with him and then he's, is not had surgery. So that's an issue physically for them in a sexual context. But it was important to me that the two of them are symbols of we are enough. You can love. You don't have to look a certain way to be loved and accepted. And I want them to sort of be symbols for that it's possible to love and find someone. We all find someone. There's always someone who will love us. But if we keep our hearts open, that's the only way to make it happen. So I wanted them to really show that imperfection can be perfect. And they are perfect for each other. They've met, they both have lots of physical imperfections. And then of course, Bethany, who's so beautiful on the outside, and then she has this mental thing, but she has found Renee, and Renee loves her and deals with her mental health issues and all of this. So I think the book is really just talking about ordinary people in an extraordinary situation. And I think it's a little different because they're so realistically imperfect. Everybody in books says, oh, this character has such and such, but we don't know much about it. But I think it's important to really know about it and to be honest about it. And that's what creates a real character, real flaws and physicalities that are not perfect. So I just wanted to show that. And it's very much coming from my own life experience. And I just know that there should be people in books that also are flawed, because every single person I've ever met is flawed, highly flawed. So I think that is important to start being more honest about that in our characters.
Good. And I think that's what I was talking about sort of earlier when I began my talk about how the book very much normalizes non-normative experiences and non-normative bodies, thereby ultimately deconstructing what we even think about as norms and normal. Right. Everyone is struggling with something. And I also appreciated that you dealt with what we call invisible disabilities, or disabilities that are not readily seen by onlookers, because not only do we live in a world that I feel we don't, at least in this country, and I travel extensively in Europe, and I can tell you it's worse there. We don't make a space for disabled bodies, for them to be able to function and show up and be active in whatever the context. I mean, there are like, would you believe, like in certain places, like I've been, to doctors' offices in Berlin where it's 4 stories up and there's no elevator.
Right.
Well, why do you have a doctor's office on the 4th floor? Like, really? It's just that kind of lack of thinking and planning a society around that. And so, and when people do think of disabled bodies, we tend to think of someone in a wheelchair, which you have, or someone in crutches or something like that, but having some sort of physical mobility, or physical expressive difference from what we think of as norms. And but it's much deeper than that, and it's disability and how we relate to our bodies. It's much deeper than just the surface level, which I can appreciate that you explore in the book. And also, I'm not sure if you meant to do this or if you were aware, but in trans studies we do a lot of overlap with disability studies, and there's quite a bit of trans disability criticism that's been written as well. So I wasn't sure if you were aware of sorry guys, the phone. I meant to turn it off. I wasn't sure if you were aware of that. But that actually, it helps me, teach a book like yours in a classroom. So I think we've got about 20 minutes or so. So why don't we kind of chill for a minute? We've got some other things that we can talk about if people don't have questions, but let's just chill a little bit, because we want to give other folks an opportunity to give their 2 cents or ask a question or what have you, the participants. I want to open that up for folks.
Yes, thank you so much. That is a good timing, and we still have some time for some questions and answers, and we're going to ask our folks to, feel free to use the chat if you don't want to unmute. I have to say, I am so excited to read the book. I can't wait to, really dig into it. And I'm going to tell you how excited I am to hear about all the intersectionality that exists amongst the characters that you were both talking about. There's so much that already I can envision in some of the topics. And I appreciate you sharing about the process of grief. I've read some articles, which really just talk about a different perspective, and some would say that feelings of grief and loss are not even associated with transition, and I've read those articles and I question, like, I wonder why, right? And after all, it's like, why would you grieve your old self, is kind of what the articles would talk about, and that self doesn't resonate with who you are. But the question also becomes like, well, what if the feelings of grief and loss go deeper than the sense of self? Where there is loss, then the grief usually follows. And so I think acknowledging that, the character, and then the those around the characters, or those around the people that are going through it, that it's, it's a process that everybody goes through if they're supportive, if they're supportive of the person going through transition, then I think it's a natural process for everyone. And in a way, depending on how they see it, right? You can see it as a healing process, or you can see it as a beautiful process where you're processing together, being able to say, okay, we're moving to a new transition, a new sense of self, a new deeper connection to claiming who my family will be, my friends will be, my career will be, like all these elements to really embody that next part of your life. And so I really, appreciated that, because I think that oftentimes we lose that factor of understanding the humanity side of like what's happening, what's the emotional side of what folks are going through. And so, I think about that, and I think about like the normal grief of, not normal grief, but when somebody loses somebody, it's different. But when you're going through a transit, it's a whole different type of process of grief.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciated that you highlighted that. But overall, I'm excited to read. I love that you shared the characters, imperfectly perfect, characters, and talk about love. You talk about acceptance. And, you know, this week it was interesting because I've been in conversations with other people about the topic of love and talking about unconditional love and what that really means.
Mm-hmm.
What does that really mean? So when we look at the word unconditional, many times people have conditions when it's supposed to be unconditional. And so, you know, really thinking about, I think, our trans community and thinking about how does, if we have it difficult discussing that, imagine
Mm-hmm.
those that are really having to try to describe what love is.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really just excited that you were able to talk about that today and have this conversation, because I think, you know, for many folks we can have that, but you know, to have it in characters or to have it in books where we can really read about it and in a different way and learn about it through a different lens is always a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, I can talk forever, and so I do want to open it up for questions. So thank you.
Thank you. That was really thoughtful and thought-provoking. I have some thoughts about some, but I want other people to have a chance to talk.
I have a question. I read a lot of romance novels, and just I was a huge Nicholas Sparks fan growing up. And now I'm older, I'm getting more into women like writers.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I'm very curious, like how I haven't read the book either, which, and yes, I'm very excited to, you know, get the opportunity to read it. But how do you write from different point of views? Like if you did write, and if so, did you write from different point of views, and how did you gain that perspective per se?
Well, that's a really good question. I think the greatest thing about being a writer is being a listener. And so you have to listen to people on a really deep level. And so I spend a lot of time listening to people. And so I understand their perspectives when I listen to them, when they tell me, even if they're complaining or yelling or whatever they're doing, I'm thrilled because I'm learning their perspective. And so when I was writing the book, and I wrote it from 4 different perspectives, I had to like put myself in all those different places, which makes me much more open to the human experience because I'm listening to all different perspectives. And so even the Bethany character, who's the one who sort of symbolizes the loss, you know, she came up because when I was interviewing her child transitioning, and she told me a story that I tell a lot because I think it's so important, that she listened to her child voice changing on the answering machine. And when she heard the male version of her once daughter, she just cried about it. And she said to me, it was like a death. It's a death because my daughter died when my son became my son. So I think those are like that whole idea of it's a death, a mourning, that was like, oh, that I have to have a character that really explores that, because that is one of the pieces, like I mentioned, is not mentioned a lot. So it's just really interesting to set up a scenario and then look at all different sides of it. So that's a way to do it. Like you look at it, the situation, and then look at it from all different places. What if it was the mother? What if it was the child? And then I think that's how you sort of gain access to all these different feelings.
Thank you.
You're welcome. That's a great question.
I thought of another question, but I just want to make sure if there's anybody else that wants to go first.
Oh, somebody just had a really, the question about the playwrights.
Yeah, that was mine.
Yeah, that's a great question too. I would love to, well, I actually want to make a movie of the book. And that's not an egotistical thing. It's not because I want a movie of my book, but it's because I think it would be such a breakthrough for Black trans love that's positive, that becomes a positive story to be on screen. Because like I'm saying, I really like the idea of putting out something in the world that expands us and not something that just keeps us back. And so to me, I would love to have that. And I'm glad that you mentioned it. I'm actually working on sort of a pitch packet right now for somebody about a movie. So we're just trying to work on this, but it's just been so busy. But we are working on visualizing vicissitudes, because I think that that is a way to reach more people, because the internet has come and people don't read as much as they used to. It's important. It's still such an important story to me. And I say that humbly because I created it, but it's not about me and my writing or anything. It's really about this idea of what if we love people who are not supposed to, quote unquote, be loved? What if we listen to our hearts? And so I just want that I think is an important idea, especially in these turbulent times. So thank you. That's a good question.
Yeah, and I can feel that, because even in just the conversation with the characters and describing the characters, I was already imagining and thinking about like, wow, like I could totally see this in some sort of film or play on stage, like or being portrayed in so many different. I love theater, and I and I
I
think
didn't know that.
about, yeah, just thinking about the potential, right, of highlighting these narratives and these characters. And yeah, so I'm glad
Maybe a
that
novella.
you're writing a pitch. That's amazing.
It would be a serial drama would be an opportunity to really delve deeply and explore in an expansive way. Yeah. I want to say something too, that several of you all have mentioned around love and loss. And because there's there's a young child in the book who's a student of John's, and he's transitioning, and his name is Teague, and his mother is an advocate for him, and at the same time she struggles with his pronoun. She keeps referring to him as she. Teague is really a female to male, and he's sort of the younger generation. He's just kicked the door open and I'm here, I'm trans, get used to it, and he challenges in many ways John's choice to be stealth and to just sort of keep his identity to himself. And also Teague's character gives us an opportunity to see the sexism and the homophobia and things like that trans people have to deal with in the workforce. So there's a number of reasons why. But one of the things that got me to thinking about what, when Carolina was talking a little earlier about love and loss, is an unconditional love, and that kind of love between parents and children, the kind of love between partners, particularly if it's long term, you've been together for a long time, you're each one is ace in the hole, and you come to depend on each other. Sometimes I wonder if what happens when people get into the sticking point around transition and processing the loss, processing it, mourning it, is a fear of loss, is a fear of fear of a loss of love. And I realize I'm not being specific here deliberately, in part because I'm talking about all the people in the situation, the person transitioning and the parents, the partner transitioning and the partner. And what keeps people from sitting together and processing together may be a fear of losing love. And it's in particular, we're talking about deep love. We're I mean, like I said, parent-child love. Like my mother loved me unconditionally. And when you were talking, Catalina, some of the things that was going through my head was what unconditional love gives you, particularly as a child, is it gives you an unshakable sense of validation and positive sense of being, because there's always this other person that's there, and that's kind of the wellspring for that love. And I wonder sometimes when people get into these situations where we can't be patient with our partners as they mourn that loss, or we get angry at our parents because, for after 5 years, mom, come on, you haven't gotten the pro, is because we actually ironically may fear that we're going to lose them. And if we lose them, then here we are all out there by ourselves as trans people. We're already marginalized, and we get impatient, and we sometimes impose or have a belief about people that they're just not on board, or they're just like all the rest of society, they're against me. We sort of easily lapse into that way of thinking, rather than just learning to be patient and sit with people as they're having their yucky feelings. I mean, a lot of times we don't want to deal with our yucky feelings either. It's hard to sit through that stuff. So I just, I wonder, just throwing that out there.
Agreed.
I mean, love is complicated. The moment you try to define it, it slips, the attempt to define it slips away. And I also want to say that I think when Black people talk about love, that's revolutionary. And what I mean by that, it's not that, like, we have love in our communities, but we are not like historically in the movies, historically in literature, we are not represented as loving people. Even when it comes to our own, we don't represent, we don't talk or express that as much. We see Black on Black crime. We see, and we talk about that. But how often do we talk about the Black school teachers who stay after school for hours upon hours, coaching our kids, keeping them out of trouble, or Black people struggling through difficult things like these issues, like transitioning and loving someone who you never imagined you'd fall in love with. Because when Black people tell our story in America, we talk about struggle and vicissitudes, okay? The vagaries and vicissitudes of being Black in America. You build a fortress, build an empire, and then you get shut out of it. We know that story. But one of the things in particular I like about Black women's fiction is the exploration of love and possibilities of love in Black communities, because that is where you heal from the trauma, the historical trauma that has been enacted upon the race, the trauma that we deal with every day in our communities. That, to me, I still see a long line of history going back to slavery and Jim Crow. And so Bell Hooks did a whole book on Black love, that was huge for her to do that. It's so this other thing is, talking about love as transformative possibility. So we as Black people, we've got to have those conversations, because we're not just always fighting the man. Like, our lives is way more complicated than that. And there is love in Black communities. There is tough love. There's tough love. Mama's love is tough love sometimes. and there's nurturing love, and transformative love. There's love as it builds us up and builds each other up. So anyway, I'll have enough of it. But I just think it's really important, when Black people have conversations about love in communities, because we tend to not to, our narrative isn't represented that way. And even when we tell those stories, we tend to focus on Black crime, or, Black people's struggle against white supremacy. But I'll give you a good example, like in the voter drive over the summer, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, there was a lot of struggle and a lot of push and a lot of just, people of color in general coalitioning around registering people to vote, pushing back against the machine that of Jim Crow, you know, South. And so the narrative that comes out of that is the narrative of Black struggle in relation with Latinos and Asians against just Jim Crow South. What you don't hear about are the incredible good times that people actually had as they knocked on hundreds or thousands of doors, as they organized late into the night. They were tired, but because they were together, unified in a project together, they also loved each other. They loved each other with food. They loved each other with family. They loved each other by opening their homes up and inviting other people in. So that's what I mean about Black love. It's like there's more to Black people's existence than simply struggling against you know, the system. And I think that story too is just as important and should be explored and told as well for its transformative possibilities. So,
Yeah.
all right, that's enough because I'm a professor and I can talk forever. So it's not my hour. It's Miss Green's and Carolina's and you all. So,
well, we're down to the last 2 minutes, and I just,
okay.
you know, if want to make sure I give an opportunity for Ms. Green to do any closing remarks, or if there's one last quick question, we'll certainly take that. You know, whether you want to put that in the chat or not. I just want to say really briefly that we are going to be purchasing some additional books to give out to everyone that attended today and that joined us. So make sure you email us. Andrea will put our email in the chat and provide us with your address, and we will get some books shipped out to you once they are, you know, sent in to us. So thank you so much for participating, and I'll pass it over to Ms. Green.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about something that is very important to me. And hopefully just the idea of transforming oneself is very important to other people as well. And I am hopeful that you guys will read the book, or the school will adopt the book and use it in classrooms and things, because I think that's really, it's a very easy way to learn about the trans experience without having to read too many textbooks per se. I mean, it really like gets you in there quickly. And I would love to come back. So if there's if that ever is a possibility, I'm always open to come back to you and talk. And thank you again for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Carolina and Andrea. I really appreciate you all for just creating the programs and taking care of all the promoting and the flyers and setting everything up. Thank you so much. You're a vital part of making this possible. And it's great to be able to bring folks in from the outside to the university, even as we're living with COVID. So you have no idea how valuable you guys are in these times. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. All right, any other parting folks?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a wrap.
All right.
We appreciate
Thank you, guys.
That was a wonderful, I'm just so excited to get my hands on that book.
Oh, I can't wait.
Yeah, I can't wait.
I think you'll love it, Caroline. I was serious when I said that. I was because when Kim sent it to me originally, I told her I'm on my way to Berlin. I've got some filming to do, but I'll take a look at it when I get back in a couple of weeks. And so I just took a peek. I always do that. You just want to see the first couple pages just to see, can they write? Is it any good? You know, because I get a lot of stuff sometimes, you know, coming through. And I opened it up and I was reading it, and I read it in 3 days. It's just couldn't stop.